The ink was still wet on the page when Silas Abbott tore it from the press. Louisa Fairchild did not flinch. She stood her ground in the center of her print shop, hands locked at her sides, chin raised, watching him crumple the broadsheet into a ball and hurl it against the freshly whitewashed wall. The paper unfolded slowly, like a dying flower, and settled on the plank floor between them. "You print this," he said, and his voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded storms and gunshots, "and every man in Caldwell County will have a reason to burn this building to the ground with you inside it." "Then they will burn it," Louisa said, "and the story will still be true." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Silas stared at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something she had not expected from the man everyone in Redemption, Texas, called the most fearsome rancher west of the Brazos River. She saw fear. Not fear of her, not fear of the broadsheet, but something older and more personal, something that lived behind his jaw and made the muscle there tick like a trapped clock. "You don't understand what you've started," he said. "I understand exactly what I've started," she replied. "That is the trouble with me, Mr. Abbott. I always do." He stepped closer, and she held her position, refusing to step back though her pulse was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. He was a tall man, wide through the shoulders, with dark hair that wanted cutting and the kind of face that had been beaten into character by sun and wind and time. He smelled of horses and wood smoke and something else, something underneath all of that, something that had been bothering Louisa Fairchild since the first morning he had walked through her door and told her she was going to ruin everything. He had been right, of course. He was right about almost everything, and she despised him for it almost as much as she could not stop thinking about him. "The men named in that article," he said, dropping his voice even lower, "they are not just ranchers, Louisa. They are the men who own the county sheriff. They own the circuit judge. If you print this, there is no law to protect you. There is no one who will come." "Then I will protect myself," she said. He reached down and picked up the crumpled page. He smoothed it out against his thigh with one broad hand, and he read it again, his eyes moving slowly across the words she had set with her own hands, letter by letter, in the compositor's box she had carried across 400 miles of frontier because her father had taught her that the press was the only honest power a person without wealth or guns could hold. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted. The storm was still there, but something else had arrived alongside it. "You named Harlan Cole," he said. "I did. Harlan Cole, who had my father killed." The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the wind working at the loose shutter on the north wall and the distant sound of a horse on the street outside. "I know," Louisa said softly. "That is precisely why I named him." She watched the revelation move through Silas Abbott like a wave through still water, and she understood for the first time that the man standing in front of her was not simply angry. He was undone, and she had done it. She had put the truth into type and handed him the weapon he had been circling for 11 years. And now neither of them could go back to the careful, combative distance they had been maintaining since the morning in September when she had rolled into Redemption, Texas, on the seat of a hired wagon with a printer's box in the bed and her own opinions already fully formed. It had been 1882 when Louisa Fairchild arrived in Redemption, which was a name the town had given itself with considerably more optimism than the surrounding geography warranted. The Brazos country in high summer was a landscape of extremes, broad skies slamming down onto flat brown earth, mesquite trees standing in the heat like exhausted old men, the occasional creek running just enough water to tease a person into believing the land was merciful. It was not merciful, but it was honest, and Louisa had always preferred honesty to comfort. She was 26 years old, which was considered by most of the women in the Missouri town she had left behind to be a dangerously advanced age for a woman who had not yet married. She had a face that people called handsome rather than pretty, which she had long since accepted as a compliment, because pretty faded and handsome had something structural beneath it. Her hair was dark brown, and she wore it pinned up with more efficiency than elegance. Her eyes were a particular shade of hazel that went green when she was angry, and she had been angry enough in her life that several people had come to think her eyes were simply green. She had learned the printing trade from her father, Samuel Fairchild, who had run a weekly newspaper in Independence, Missouri for 30 years before a stroke took him in the spring of 1882. He had left her the compositor's box, 3 reams of good newsprint, a case of ink, and a worn leather notebook filled with his thoughts on journalism, which could be summarized as, "Tell the truth, print it accurately, and do not apologize for it afterward." He had not left her enough money to continue in Independence, where the paper was immediately claimed by a creditor who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. What he had left her was the knowledge of the trade and a letter from a man in Redemption, Texas named Ezra Potts, who had written to her father the previous year inquiring whether anyone knew of a printer willing to come west and start a paper. The town had a population of 400 and growing. It had a saloon, a mercantile, a livery, a doctor, and a church. It did not have a newspaper. Louisa had written back to Ezra Potts herself, representing herself as a printer and editor of some experience, which was true, omitting the fact that she was a woman, which felt less dishonest to her than it might have to someone who had not been reading her father's leather notebook. The wagon journey from the nearest rail terminus had taken 6 days. On the 7th day, she rolled into Redemption on a Tuesday morning in early September and climbed down from the wagon in front of the building Ezra Potts had rented for the newspaper office, and Ezra Potts, who was 72 years old and walked with a cane, and had the startled expression of a man who had just been informed that the floor was not where he thought it was, stood on the step and looked at her for a long, silent moment. "You are Miss Fairchild," he said. "I am," she said. "I had understood," he said carefully, "that a printer was coming." "I am a printer," she said equally carefully. "I have brought my compositor's box as evidence should you require it." Ezra Potts had turned out to be a man of more flexibility than his expression suggested. He was one of the original settlers of Redemption, a man who had buried a wife and 2 sons to fever and drought and kept going regardless, and he had a pragmatic view of the world that had been polished to a fine edge by years of survival. He needed a newspaper. There was a printer. He adjusted. It was Ezra who, on her 3rd day in Redemption, as she was arranging the press in the front room and setting her compositor's box on the work table, said with a tone that she would later identify as the sound of a person trying to warn someone who was not going to be warned, "You should know that Silas Abbott will not like this." "I do not yet know who Silas Abbott is," Louisa said, fitting a line of type into the composing stick, "and I am not certain why his feelings about a newspaper are my concern. He runs the Double A Ranch, about 8 miles east of town. His family has been in this county since before there was a county. He supplies beef to the army, employs 30 men, and has an arrangement with most of the town's major businesses. He is not a bad man," Ezra said, as if this clarification was important, "but he is a man accustomed to things proceeding in an orderly fashion, and a newspaper is not an orderly thing." Louisa had set another line of type and said nothing, which Ezra correctly interpreted as the end of the conversation. Silas Abbott arrived on a Friday afternoon, 3 days after she had published the first issue of what she called the Redemption Courier. She had chosen the name carefully. A courier carried messages. A courier was neutral. A courier delivered what needed delivering regardless of who wanted it delivered and who did not. The first issue had contained, among other things, a careful and well-sourced account of the fact that several local cattle ranchers, including Harlan Cole, who ran the largest operation in the county, had been using communal water rights along Sycamore Creek in a manner inconsistent with the original land grants. The smaller ranchers and homesteaders downstream were losing water they were legally entitled to. Louisa had spoken to 6 of them before writing a single word. Silas Abbott walked into the print shop at 4 in the afternoon, ducking his head slightly at the low doorframe, and stood with his hat in his hands looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. She had been expecting belligerence. She got something more complicated. "Miss Fairchild," he said. "Mr. Abbott," she said. She did not stop setting type. "You have caused some considerable discussion with your first edition. That is what a newspaper is for," she said. He looked around the shop, at the press, at the compositor's box, at the stacks of newsprint, at the wall where she had pinned a map of the county so she could keep track of land claims and water routes and the geometry of power. "How did you learn to do all this?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that surprised her, not condescension, something closer to genuine curiosity. "My father was a printer and editor for 30 years in Missouri," she said. "I began setting type when I was 8 years old, and you came here alone." "I came here as a printer. The alone part is incidental." He almost smiled. She saw it happen, the slight softening at the corner of his mouth before he brought it back under control. "The water rights article," he said, "is accurate," she said. "I know," he said. That surprised her enough that she put down the composing stick and looked at him directly. "You know," she said, "I know the water is being diverted. I know who is doing it." "What I do not know," he said, and now his voice had a careful quality she recognized as the sound of someone navigating around something they did not want to step on, "is whether printing it in a newspaper is the wisest way to address it." "It is the most honest way," she said. "This is not Independence, Missouri," he said. "The men who control the water in this county are not men who respond well to being named in print." "Then they should not have done what they did," she said, and picked up the composing stick again. He stood for another moment, his hat still in his hands, and she felt his gaze on her the way you feel sun through glass, present and warm and slightly more intense than entirely comfortable. "You are going to cause trouble," he said. "I have been told that before," she said. "And you found it persuasive." "Not once." He put his hat back on his head, adjusting the brim with the careful movement of a man performing a habitual gesture, and turned toward the door. Then he stopped. "If you need anything," he said, and he said it as if he was annoyed at himself for saying it. "That is, if there is anything in particular you need to know about this county before you write something else, I am willing to answer questions." She looked at him again. His back was to her, and she studied the set of his shoulders, the particular tension in them that told her this offer had cost him something he had not expected to spend. "That is very generous," she said carefully. "It is self-interested," he said. "If you are going to write about this county, I would rather you write accurately." He left, and she stood in the silence of the print shop with the composing stick in her hand and the strange, unsettled sensation of someone who has just looked at a map and discovered that the territory is more interesting than it appeared. Over the following weeks, Louisa published the Redemption Courier every Tuesday and Friday. She wrote about the water rights dispute, following it carefully and with attribution. She wrote about the proposed railroad spur that would bring the line through Redemption and what it would mean for the town's economy. She wrote about a family of homesteaders named Prentice who had been burned out on land they were legally settled on, and she was careful and thorough, and she named everyone who needed naming. Silas Abbott came to the print shop 3 more times in those weeks. Each time he ostensibly came to offer information or correction, and each time the conversation wandered considerably beyond the stated purpose. He told her about the county's history. She told him about Missouri and her father's paper. He brought her a hand-drawn survey map of the original land grants that he had obtained from some source he declined to specify. She used it extensively. The 3rd time he came, she had a pot of coffee on the small stove in the back room, and she offered him a cup without thinking, and he accepted without thinking, and they sat across from each other at her work table for 2 hours while she asked him questions about Harlan Cole. Harlan Cole was the hidden danger at the center of everything she was discovering about Redemption. He was 58 years old, powerfully built, with a white mustache and the manners of a man who had once been somewhere considerably more civilized than where he currently was. He owned 14,000 acres and controlled considerably more through informal arrangements, and what Louisa was learning to recognize as the particular kind of threat that never quite said what it was. "He has been here 30 years, Silas said, turning his coffee cup slowly in his large hands. "He arrived with money from somewhere east, and he bought land cheap and he made arrangements, and now he is the county. He is not an official of the county. He does not need to be." "The Prentice family," Louisa said. "The fire." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "No one can prove anything," he said. "No one tried," she said. He looked at her then in a way that she felt like a hand placed flat against her sternum, steady, pressing, not aggressive, just present. "My father ran a small ranch," he said. 800 acres, well water, good grass. He had a debt to coal that he could not pay, and 11 years ago he died of a gunshot wound that was recorded as accidental. The print shop was very quiet. The wind had dropped and the town outside had settled into its evening sounds, a horse somewhere, the distant piano from the saloon. "Was it accidental?" she said. "No," he said. "It was not." He set down his coffee cup. He stood, and again she had the sense of him navigating around something invisible, something internal. "I have spent 11 years building the AA to the point where Cole cannot simply remove me the way he removed my father," he said. "I have spent 11 years waiting for the right moment and the right leverage. I am asking you," he said, and his voice was very controlled, "not to move faster than is safe." "I am asking you," she said, "what faster than safe means to a man who has been waiting 11 years. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he left. She sat alone with the map on her table and the knowledge that she had just learned the real story, not the one about water rights, but the one underneath it, the one about a dark past, a hidden motive, a murder made invisible by power, and a man who had been carrying that secret like a stone in his chest since he was young. She thought about him for a long time that night, and she did not entirely sleep. The fourth week brought an escalation she had been expecting in abstract, and found more unsettling in reality. Someone threw a rock through the front window of the print shop in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. The rock had a piece of paper wrapped around it which she unfolded and read by lamplight. The note said in large crude letters, "Women do not run newspapers. Leave before you are removed." She swept up the glass, boarded the window temporarily, and published an account of the incident in the Friday edition, including the text of the note. Silas appeared at the shop before noon on Friday, and this time he was not careful about his expression at all. "You published the note," he said. "I am a newspaper editor," she said. "That is what I do with information." "They will escalate," he said. "I know," she said. "Does that not concern you?" "It concerns me considerably," she said, "which is not the same as deterring me." He stood in the middle of the shop with his hands on his hips and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and what passed between them in that moment was wordless and complicated, and neither of them acknowledged it. "I am going to speak with the town marshal," he said. "The town marshal is a cousin of Harlan Cole's foreman," she said. He stopped. "I know that too," she said. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I am a newspaper editor, Mr. Abbott, and I have been asking questions for 4 weeks. He dragged a hand over his face in the gesture of a man who has just realized he has severely underestimated a situation. "Who else knows about the marshal?" he asked. "Several people. No one has said anything publicly." "Will you give me a few days before you print it?" he asked. She tilted her head and studied him. "Why?" "Because if you print it, Cole will know that you know, and right now your information is more dangerous than your printed words. Once it is in print, it is already spent." She had not thought of it in precisely those terms. She turned it over carefully. 3 days, she said. 4, he said. 3, she said. "And in exchange you tell me what leverage you mentioned." "The leverage you've been building." He was quiet for a long, measuring moment. Then he said, "Cole has been falsifying brand records, cattle that come off the Double C with altered brands sold to the Army quartermaster. The quartermaster has been paid to look the other way. I have been collecting documentation for 2 years. Signed bills of sale, witness statements from men who have left the county, letters. That is a federal crime, she said quietly. Yes, he said. You have enough to bring a federal case. Almost, he said. Almost is not enough. What do you still need? He hesitated. She watched him decide something. The name of the Army quartermaster, he said. I have him as an initial on a receipt. I have not been able to get the full name. Louisa walked to her compositor's box and picked up a small square of paper and a pencil. She wrote down a name and handed it to him. He looked at the paper. He went very still. Captain Warren Aldrich, he said. How do you have this? Ezra Potts, she said. He was at a dinner 2 years ago where Cole introduced Aldrich to the local businessmen as a trusted government associate. Ezra has a remarkable memory for names. Silas looked at the paper for another long moment. Then he looked at her, and what she saw in his face now was something raw and unguarded that she suspected he very rarely showed anyone. This is the piece I have been missing for 2 years, he said. I know, she said. How did you know? Because you told me you needed the quartermaster's name, and Ezra told me about the dinner, and the geometry of it was not difficult. He folded the paper carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his coat, close to his chest. Louisa, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formality of the miss, and she felt it land somewhere below her ribs, warm and slightly alarming. It is not lost on me, he said quietly, that you have just handed me the key to something I have wanted for 11 years. No, she said. I handed us both the key to something we both want. You want justice for your father. I want the truth in print. Those are not incompatible goals. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the controlled neutrality, not the suppressed irritation, not the almost smile. Something open and undefended, and she was aware suddenly of how close they were standing, and aware of her own pulse in an inconvenient and distracting way. You are the most confounding woman I have ever met, he said, and it was clearly not an insult. I have been told that as well, she said, and that one I take as a compliment. The almost smile arrived and stayed this time, and it transformed his face in a way that made her understand immediately why she had not been sleeping well. He left. She stood alone in the print shop with the knowledge that something had changed, that some threshold had been crossed, and she was not entirely sure whether to be glad of it or afraid of it. She chose, in the characteristic manner of Louisa Fairchild, to be both simultaneously. The following days moved with the particular compressed tension of a period when events are accelerating toward a point that everyone can sense but no one can see clearly. She held the story about the marshal, as she had promised. Silas rode out twice in those days. She learned later to verify the name she had given him, to send a wire through a contact in San Antonio to a federal agent he had been corresponding with for months. She wrote. She set type. She published a careful piece about the original homesteader's land rights that named Cole's foreman, a man named Burl Stannard, as having been present when the Prentice family's buildings burned. She had 3 witnesses. She named them. She knew what naming them meant for their safety, and she had spoken honestly with each of them about it, and each of them had said they wanted to be named, that their silence had protected no one. Cole's response arrived on a Monday morning in the form of Burl Stannard himself, who walked into the print shop with 2 men behind him and stood with his thumbs in his belt and told her in a flat, unhurried voice that she had until Saturday to close the paper and leave redemption. Louisa looked at him for a moment. She reached for her composing stick, which she had been holding when he walked in, and she said another line of type. I heard you, she said. You may go. Stannard's face went red. He took a step forward, and one of the men behind him moved to her press, and she stood up from her stool very fast. If you touch that press, she said, I will print every word of this conversation in Thursday's edition, including the part where you threatened me, and I will send a copy to the Federal Land Office in Austin. She did not know if this threat was well-founded. She said it anyway, because the composing stick in her hand was not a weapon, and she needed something to be won. Stannard stared at her for a long moment. Then he jerked his head at the men behind him and walked out, and the door banged against the frame with more force than necessary. She sat down on her stool, and her hands were shaking, and she pressed them flat against the work table and breathed. Silas arrived an hour later. He had, she learned, seen Stannard leave the shop from the street, and his expression when he walked in was the expression of a man who has been running. "Are you all right?" he said. It was not quite a question, which was to say it came out urgent rather than polite. "Perfectly," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. He looked at her composing stick and at her hands, which were still faintly trembling, and his jaw did the thing with the clock-like tick. "I should have been here," he said. "You could not have known," she said, "and I handled it." "How did you handle it?" she told him. He listened, and she watched the tension in his shoulders do something complicated. "The Federal Land Office bluff," he said. "It worked," she said. "It worked this time," he said. "Stannard does not think, Cole does." "Then we need to move before Cole thinks clearly about what we have," she said. He sat down across from her at the work table, the same table where they had drunk coffee, and he put both hands flat on the surface and looked at her directly. "The federal agent," he said. "His name is Henry Morse. He is in San Antonio. He has been building a case against Army contract fraud for over a year, and Cole's operation is exactly the kind of evidence he needs. I sent him everything 2 days ago. The brand records, the witness statements, the Aldrich connection. And he wired back yesterday. He is coming. He will be here within the week." "That is good," she said. "That is very good," he said. "But it means this week is the dangerous week. Cole does not know an agent is coming, but he knows he has a problem, and problems make him act." They looked at each other across the table, and the lamp between them made shadows move across his face in a way that she found herself noting with an attention she would have preferred to redirect. "I am going to print the full story," she said, "not waiting for the agent before he arrives." Silas looked at her sharply. "If the story is in print before the agent arrives," she said, "it cannot be suppressed. If it is only in our hands, Cole can remove it by removing us. But a printed broadsheet with 500 copies distributed to every household and business in the county, sent to every newspaper in Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas, is not something you can unprint." He was quiet. She could see him running the argument through his mind, testing it. "You would be announcing the case before it is made," he said. "I would be announcing the facts before they can be hidden," she said. "The case is Henry Morse's job. My job is the truth." He looked at her for a long time. "This is what I warned you about," he said, "the first day I came here." "You warned me that printing the truth would cause trouble," she said. "You were right, it has. It will continue to. I'm asking whether you trust me to know what I am doing." There was a word that lived underneath the question she had asked. She was aware of it, trust. Whether he trusted her. Whether they had built enough in these weeks of coffee and maps and information exchanged, and a name in a breast pocket to make trust something real between them. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked up at her, and she saw the moment he made the decision. "Print it," he said. "Print all of it." That was the night she worked until 3 in the morning, setting the longest article she had ever written. 1,040 words of careful documented truth about Harlan Cole, the water theft, the brand fraud, the purchased silence of the marshal, the burned homestead, and the name of a captain in the United States Army whose signature appeared on receipts for cattle that had never legally belonged to the man who sold them. She named her sources. She printed the dates. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. She printed 200 copies in the small hours before dawn, and when the sun came up, she had done 50 of them in sealed envelopes with addresses she had prepared. And Ezra Potts, who had appeared at 5 in the morning without being asked and without explanation, sat across from her addressing the remaining envelopes with a hand that shook slightly from age but did not stop. Silas arrived at 7, and he took the bound stack of envelopes addressed to the Austin Statesman, the San Antonio Express, and the Dallas Morning News, and he rode to the telegraph office and sent wires to each of the papers. And then he rode to the nearest postal station, which was 14 miles, and sent the envelopes. By the time the redemption courier appeared on front steps and in the Mercantile and in the church hall at 8 on a Thursday morning, a copy was already on its way to every major newspaper in Texas. Harlan Cole came to the print shop at 10. He did not send Stannard. He came himself, which told Louisa more than anything else she had observed about him. He was a man who understood when something required his personal attention. He was as she had imagined him from descriptions, tall, white-haired, possessed of a certain formal courtesy that lived on the surface and concealed something considerably less courteous beneath. He closed the door carefully behind him and stood in the center of the shop and looked at the press and then at her. "Miss Fairchild," he said, "I believe we have a problem to discuss." "I believe," she said, "that I have already said everything I intend to say on the subject, and it is in print." Cole smiled. It was a smile she had seen before in different faces in different places, the smile of someone who has not yet realized that the landscape has changed beneath them. "The men I know in the land office," he began. "The envelopes left this morning," she said. "To Austin, to San Antonio, to Dallas, and a personal letter to Federal Agent Henry Morse, who I understand will arrive in Redemption within the week. I took the liberty of including the name of Captain Warren Aldrich and the signed receipt." The smile left his face. "You are a very young woman," he said, and his voice had changed, the courtesy gone, something colder and more direct in its place, "to have made this kind of decision. And you are a man who killed another man's father and has been doing it for decades in one form or another," she said, "so I believe my decisions are well-founded." The door of the print shop opened behind Cole and Silas Abbott walked in. Cole turned. He looked at Silas for a long moment, and something passed between them that had 11 years of weight and grief and hidden motive behind it. "Abbott," Cole said. "Cole," Silas said. Silas was not wearing a gun, which Louisa noticed and which she suspected was deliberate. He stood in the doorway with his arms loose at his sides, and he said, in a voice that was entirely level, "Agent Morse wired me an hour ago. He is already on the Texas and Pacific. He will arrive in 3 days." Cole looked at him. He looked back at Louisa. He looked at the press, at the compositor's box, at the stacks of printed broadsheets remaining on the table. "You have been planning this for some time," he said. "We have both been planning various parts of it for some time," Silas said. "Miss Fairchild has been planning her part for somewhat less time, but she is considerably faster than most people." The thing that Louisa found remarkable afterward was that Cole did not rage. He did not threaten. He seemed to understand with the clarity of an intelligent man who has just seen a trap close that there was no longer any useful action to take. The story was in print. The envelopes were in transit. The federal agent was on a train. He put his hat back on his head and looked at Silas and said, "This is not finished." "It is finished enough," Silas said. Cole left. Silas closed the door behind him and turned, and Louisa was still standing at her work table with her hands locked together in front of her, because she was afraid that if she unclenched them, she would discover that they were shaking again. He crossed the shop in 3 steps and took her hands in his, unclenching them, and she let him. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said, "I think so." "You were extraordinary," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way she had not heard before. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what makes it extraordinary." They stood in the print shop with her hands in his and the press behind her, and the morning light coming through the boarded window and the remaining broadsheets on the table, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the thing that had been accumulating between them over weeks of maps and coffee and argued choices and shared danger arrived fully formed in the moment, and there was nothing to do with it but acknowledge it. "You were going to warn me not to print it," she said. "This morning. Before you changed your mind." "Yes," he said. "What changed your mind?" "You did," he said simply. "You always do." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said, "You should know that I will not stop being who I am. This press is not a temporary arrangement. My opinions are not something I am going to modify." "I know that," he said. "I am informing you," she said, "because it seems relevant." "You are informing me," he said, and now the almost smile was completely present, full and unguarded, "because you want to know if I find it relevant." "Do you?" she said. "Louisa," he said, "I walked into this shop 4 weeks ago because I was afraid of what you would do. I have spent 4 weeks watching what you do. I am no longer afraid. I am something considerably more complicated than afraid." "What are you?" she said. He brought her hands up and held them closer, and he said, "I am fairly certain I am in love with you. I recognize that this is poor timing." She felt something open in her chest like a window thrown wide in spring. "It is not poor timing," she said. "It is precisely the right timing. The press is up. The story is printed. Cole is gone. This is the moment when nothing terrible is actively happening. Give it 10 minutes, he said. She laughed, and the laugh surprised her. The full, genuine kind that she did not produce often because she spent most of her time being competent and serious. He looked at her laughing as if the sound of it was something he intended to remember. "I am in love with you as well," she said, "which I have been ignoring successfully for approximately 3 weeks. "Only 3 weeks," he said. "I have been losing the argument with myself for 4. "You are slower than I am," she said. "Everyone is slower than you are," he said, and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have been circling something for weeks and have finally stopped moving away from it. And it lasted long enough that the morning light had shifted by the time they separated. Agent Henry Morse arrived in Redemption 4 days later on the Texas and Pacific, and he was a compact, efficient man with reading glasses and a warrant already written, and he read the Redemption Courier in its entirety on the platform before he shook anyone's hand. He looked up at Louisa and said, "This is the most thorough piece of preparatory journalism I have encountered in 15 years of federal work." "My father would have been pleased to hear that," she said. The arrest of Harlan Cole took place on a gray October morning, and the arrest of Captain Warren Aldrich followed in San Antonio the following week, conducted by Morse's colleagues in the federal district. The county marshal resigned before he could be removed. The water rights matter was referred to the Texas Land Office, and over the following months the diversion equipment on Sycamore Creek was dismantled, and the downstream properties received formal documentation of their legal access. The Homesteader family, the Prentices, had scattered after the fire. The oldest son was located in Kansas. Louisa wrote him a letter. He wrote back. The land was returned to them by court order in the spring. None of it was simple. None of it was quick. Federal cases moved at the pace of federal cases, which was the pace of a creek in August, and there were weeks when Louisa received letters from Cole's lawyers, letters that were carefully worded and technically without threat, but were not without menace. She published one of them in the Courier, explaining in an accompanying piece why she had done so. This did not discourage further letters, but it discouraged them from arriving with the same confidence. Through all of it, Silas was present in a way that was neither intrusive nor distant, which she had not expected, and which she found herself depending on in a way that was new to her. He had a habit of arriving at the print shop in the late afternoons with information or coffee or both, and he had a habit of sitting at the work table while she set type, reading or simply present, and she had a habit of talking through her articles out loud while she worked, which she had done alone before but found worked better with someone listening. He was a good listener. He asked the right questions, and he did not ask unnecessary ones. He had a dry, precise sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly and made her lose her composure in a way she enjoyed. He knew the county the way a man knows a country he has lived in his whole life, not just the geography but the history and the people and the particular quality of the light at different seasons. He told her about his father, not just the death but the life, the man John Abbott had been, the small ranch and the hard work and the particular love a man has for land he has worked with his own hands. He did not do this all at once. He did it over time, in pieces, the way a person offers something valuable, carefully and in portions, checking to see that it is received the way it was intended. She told him about her father, too, about Samuel Fairchild and the smell of ink and the leather notebook, and the moral conviction that had been pressed into her like type into paper over 30 years of watching a man live by his principles, even when those principles cost him considerably. "You are very like him," Silas said one evening. "I hope so," she said. "I mean it as the highest compliment," he said. They married in February of 1883, which was 5 months after she had arrived in Redemption with a printer's box and her own opinions. And the wedding was in the church that stood on the main street, performed by the minister who had become one of the Courier's most reliable subscribers. Ezra Potts stood up for them both, because he was the only person in the county who could be said to have known them both from the beginning, and he did so with an expression of satisfaction so complete that several people commented on it afterward. Silas's ranch house was 8 miles east of town, and Louisa kept the print shop in town, which was a practical arrangement that some people found unorthodox, and which neither of them paid any attention to. She rode in on Monday and Thursday mornings and published on Tuesday and Friday, and she hired a young man named Thomas Creek, who was 19 and hungry to learn the trade, as her assistant and eventually her compositor. The house itself was a substantial one for the frontier, stone below and timber above, with a wide front porch that looked out over the grass toward the Brazos and a kitchen that was larger than it needed to be, which Silas had built the previous year with a vague hope he had not entirely articulated to himself until recently. She arranged the kitchen and the parlor, and she put her father's leather notebook on the bookshelf in the sitting room. And when she stood on the front porch in the early mornings with her coffee and looked out at the grass turning gold in the autumn sun, she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was where she was supposed to be. This was not to say that there was no trouble. There was always trouble. The Courier's circulation grew through 1883, and with growth came both new readers and new opposition. There was a man named Gareth Price who bought a portion of Cole's dismantled empire and attempted to run a similar operation with more caution, and Louisa spent 6 months documenting it with the same methodical care she had applied to Cole, and the second case was quieter than the first but no less complete. Silas, through the legal proceedings following Cole's arrest, was able to present the full account of his father's death to a federal hearing. There was no conviction, because the man most directly responsible had himself died in 1878, but there was a formal record, and the land that had been taken from the Abbott family through debt manipulation was returned to Silas by order of the land court. He rode out to the original property on a cold January morning, and she rode with him, and he stood at the fence line of the old land and did not speak for a long time, and she stood beside him and did not require him to. Later he said, "I thought it would feel like more. I thought when it was settled it would feel like a door closing." "Does it not?" she said. "It feels like a door opening," he said, "to what I have now." "That is not what I expected." "It is better," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is considerably better." Their first child was born in November of 1883, a boy they named Samuel John Abbott, Samuel for her father and John for his. He was born at the ranch house with the doctor who had come to town partly because of a piece Louisa had written in the Courier about the need for reliable medical care in the county. Silas paced the front porch for 4 hours in November cold while the doctor worked, and when the cry finally came through the window, he stopped moving and stood very still. And when Louisa held the baby out to him, for the first time he took his son with a careful tenderness that she had not known he possessed until that moment, though she thought afterward she should have. He was an extraordinary father. She had not predicted this specifically, though she should have predicted it from his essential qualities: the patience, the steadiness, the capacity for attention that did not waver. He was the kind of man who talked to a baby as if the baby was a person, which Samuel eventually became, helped considerably by his father's consistent belief that he was one. The Courier continued. Through 1884 and 1885, Louisa wrote about the county and about Texas and about things that were happening beyond both, because a newspaper that only looked inward was a newspaper that missed the shape of the world. She wrote about the range wars that were spreading through the territory as the open range began to close under the pressure of barbed wire and homesteaders. She wrote about the cattle drives that were changing as the railroads extended south. She wrote about the Comanche removal, which had happened years before and whose consequences were still playing out across the landscape in ways that required acknowledgement and documentation. On this last she was careful, and she consulted people who knew more than she did, which was a principle her father had made her internalize so completely that it was simply how she thought. She spoke with a man who had been an army interpreter for 15 years and who had watched the removal. She spoke with a Comanche woman named Tosa, who was married to a German farmer east of town and who had grown up between two worlds and knew both. She published their words as accurately as she could, and she wrote in her own editorial voice that the removal had been unjust, because it had been, and because saying so in print was part of the function of an honest newspaper. She received 4 letters of protest and 32 letters of agreement, and she published selections from both. Silas read every word she published. He was her first reader, which was an honor she had not given anyone else, and which he treated with a seriousness that was not the seriousness of someone pretending to authority, but the seriousness of someone who understood that first reading was a trust. He disagreed with her sometimes. This was important. He disagreed with her about timing, occasionally, and about emphasis, and once about a particular characterization that he felt was less fair than she had intended. She listened to his disagreements the way she listened to information, with attention and without defensiveness, and sometimes she changed something, and sometimes she did not, and either way she valued the disagreement because it was honest, and because he did not offer it to control her, but to contribute to what she was doing. "You could have been an editor," she told him once. "I am a rancher," he said. "You are a man who reads everything he can find and thinks about it carefully," she said. "The ranching is the job. The reading is the occupation." He considered this. "My father was the same way," he said. "He had very few books, but he read them over and over until he knew them completely. There is a kind of reading that is about accumulation and a kind that is about depth." "My father was the same," she said. "Our fathers would have liked each other," he said. "They would have argued about everything," she said. "That is why they would have liked each other," he said. She had put down her composing stick and kissed him, right there in the middle of the print shop with Thomas Creek working in the back room and not diplomatically appearing. Their second child came in the winter of 1885, a girl they named Clara Rose, for reasons that were their own, and Clara arrived with more noise and determination than her brother had, and continued in the same vein, which made everyone who knew the family find it entirely predictable. Through 1886, the county changed, as the whole territory was changing. The cattle kingdom was fragmenting under economic pressure, falling beef prices, 2 hard winters, the enclosure of land that had been open. Several of the large ranchers, men who had built empires on open range and cheap credit, found themselves reduced or ruined. Silas's operation survived because he had spent years building it with less debt than most, because he adapted to changing markets, and because he had an unusually clear-eyed view of what was coming based on extensive reading and a journalist wife who kept him informed. He sold cattle to new markets in the north as the trail drives faded. He diversified into horses, which were always wanted, and into a small amount of grain farming on the lower acreage near the creek. He hired men he treated fairly and paid at the edge of what the market would bear, which meant he kept good men while others lost theirs. Louisa wrote about all of it, the changing cattle economy, the new homesteaders arriving from the east as land opened, the specific and complicated grief of a frontier that was ceasing to be frontier, becoming instead something more settled and more constrained, losing both the freedom and the danger of its earlier period. She wrote a piece in 1886 about the printer's box her father had left her, which she still used, which she intended to use until it was worn past using. She wrote about the journey from Missouri and what she had found when she arrived, the town, the trouble, the man who had told her she was going to cause problems and had then stayed to help her cause them. She wrote it as a personal essay, which she did rarely, and it was the most reprinted piece she ever published in the Courier, copied in papers as far as New York City, from which she received a letter that summer from a woman editor who said she had read it aloud to her staff. Silas read that piece with an expression she could not entirely read, which was rare. "You wrote about me," he said. "I wrote about the truth," she said. "You are part of the truth." "You described me as formidable and wrong-headed," he said. "In the beginning," she said. "The piece does not end there." "No," he said. He looked at the page for another moment. Then he said, "Your father would have published this." "He would have suggested 3 edits," she said, "and then published it." "What were the 3 edits?" The second paragraph needed tightening. The transition in the middle was weak, and he would have removed the word considerably from the last line. "He would have been right about all 3, Silas said. "He usually was," she said. Samuel was 4 by then, and Clara was 1, and the house was noisier than it had been, and the front porch conversations happened later in the evenings when the children were sleeping, which was later than it used to be because Samuel did not consider sleep a useful activity. He had his mother's sense of the value of information and spent considerable energy acquiring it from anyone willing to supply it, which meant every ranch hand and every visitor was regarded as a resource. Silas watched his son with an expression Louisa had come to recognize as the one where he was storing something, filing it in the particular archive he kept of things worth keeping. "He is exactly like you," Silas told her one evening. "He has your patience," she said. "He argues like you," Silas said. "He argues because he has questions," she said. "That is different from arguing." "In this family," Silas said, "it is difficult to distinguish the two." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had taken to doing in the evenings on the porch, and he put his arm around her with the ease of a man who has found a position that suits him and sees no reason to change it. The evening was warm, late spring of 1886, and the grass was green and the sky was doing extraordinary things in the west, layers of pink and gold and a particular shade of copper that she had not seen anywhere but Texas, and Samuel was not sleeping inside, which they could tell by the sound of his boots on the floorboards, and Clara was, because she was practical even at 1 year old and understood the purpose of sleep when she was tired. "Are you content?" Silas asked. He asked it seriously, the way he asked everything serious without ornamentation. She considered it equally seriously. "Content is not the right word," she said. "Content implies a settling. I am not settled. I am more alive than I have ever been." "That is a better answer than content," he said. "Are you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky going gold over the Brazos. "My father wanted me to have this," he said. "Not this specifically, but something like it. A life that had substance to it, something worth building." He paused. "I spent 11 years trying to build the thing that would right what happened to him, and then I built it and it was done, and I did not know what to do with the rest of the life. And then you arrived with that printer's box and your particular convictions, and the rest of the life became obvious. I arrived in a hired wagon," she said, "with a very heavy compositor's box and an extremely strong opinion about water rights." "I know," he said. "I watched you climb down from that wagon. You had ink on your sleeve that you were not aware of." "You watched me from where?" she said. "I was in the mercantile," he said. "I saw the wagon come up the street. I saw you climb down. I saw Ezra's expression when he realized you were a woman. I thought, that is a woman who is not going to be reasoned with." "And was that appealing or alarming?" she said. He thought about this with characteristic honesty. "Both," he said, "at the same time, which I believe is where I have remained ever since." She laughed, and he turned his head and kissed her temple, and inside the house Samuel had found something interesting enough to distract him from his boots. In the fall of 1887, When Clara was 2 and walking with the specific determination of a person who has places to be, and Samuel was 5 and beginning to read with a speed that alarmed his teacher and delighted his parents, the Redemption Courier celebrated its 5th year of publication. Louisa marked the occasion with a retrospective issue that collected some of what she considered the most important pieces from those 5 years, alongside a new editorial about what she believed honest journalism owed its readers and its community. She wrote in that editorial about the printer's box. She wrote about her father setting it up on the table in the Independence shop when she was 8 years old, showing her how to sort the type by hand, letter by letter, teaching her the smell of ink and the particular satisfaction of a well-set line. She wrote about the day he had let her compose a full paragraph on her own, watching over her shoulder with a silence that was more encouraging than any praise. She wrote about the morning she had loaded the box onto the wagon for the journey west, and how it had felt like carrying her father with her. She wrote about redemption, and what it had been when she arrived, and what it had become. She wrote about Ezra Potts, who had died the previous spring at the age of 75, quietly in his own house, with a copy of the Courier on his lap. She wrote that Ezra had been the first person in Redemption to understand that a newspaper was not an enemy of order but its most reliable friend, because order that could not withstand examination was not order but only habit. She did not write about Silas in that editorial, because he was not hers to write about without his asking. But she wrote, at the very end, about what it meant to arrive in a new place with nothing but your work and your convictions, and to find that those things were enough to make a life. Silas read it at the kitchen table while Samuel sat beside him, eating breakfast, and Clara sat across from him, resolutely turning the pages of a book she was not yet reading, but intended to. He put the paper down when he had finished and looked at her across the table, and she looked back at him, and the look said what the editorial had not, and both of them understood it. Thomas Creek, who had been her assistant since 1883, had grown into a composed and capable printer by now, and he ran the shop on the days Louisa was at the ranch, which she was more often as the children were young, and the ranch was where they lived. She did not call this a compromise or a concession. She called it an arrangement that suited the current requirements. She still published every week. She still set her own type for the pieces that mattered most. She still had, in the back of the shop, the compositor's box, sorted and clean and ready. The 5th anniversary issue sold out in 2 days, and she ran a second printing, which was the first second printing the Courier had ever done, and she was privately pleased in the particular way that had always been more internal than external, a satisfaction so deep it barely showed on her face but that Silas could read anyway. He could read her face. This had surprised her when she first understood it, because she was not a person who considered herself easily read, and the surprise had been followed by the particular combination of vulnerability and gratitude that comes with being truly known. She could read his equally well. She had learned him over these years with the same attention she brought to a complicated story, patient and thorough, not assuming the surface was the whole, looking for what lived underneath. What lived underneath Silas Abbott, she had found, was a person of great feeling who had learned to manage that feeling into discipline, because the alternative had seemed too dangerous. He loved deeply and seriously. He was loyal past the point that loyalty required demonstration. He had a specific and somewhat irrational attachment to the mesquite tree in the yard of the house, which had been there before the house was, which he would not cut down though it dropped pods everywhere because his mother had planted it. He had not told her this for a long time. When he did, she did not say anything about it. She just made sure no one else cut it down. He brought her wildflowers in the spring, not because it was a performance, but because he passed them on the way back from the eastern range and thought of her. She kept the compositor's type sorted perfectly, which he knew mattered to her in the way that the particular order of his tools in the barn mattered to him. When she was writing something difficult, working through a problem of evidence or argument. She became very still, and her lips moved slightly, and he had learned not to interrupt that stillness and to have coffee ready when it broke. These were the specific and undramatic forms that love took in the daily life of a marriage, and she thought they were more remarkable than any of the dramatic ones. Though there had been dramatic ones too, that first conversation with Cole in the print shop, the day she had stood in the cold with him on his father's old land, the morning Samuel had been born, and he had held her hand through the last hours of it with a grip that left marks she wore for a day, and that she had not minded. The spring of 1888 was wet, which was unusual and welcome, and the grass on the Double A was extraordinary that year, deep green into May, and the cattle were fat and the horses were lively, and even the mesquite tree in the yard bloomed extravagantly. Samuel turned 6 and began riding, which Silas taught him with the patience he brought to everything, and Clara, at 3, informed the household with complete seriousness that she also intended to ride, and was told she would, and did not entirely believe this, and was proved correct within the month. Louisa was pregnant with their 3rd child, which she had been certain about since February, and had told Silas on an evening in late February when the last of the winter cold was still in the air and the fire in the sitting room was burning well. He had gone very still when she told him, the particular stillness of someone receiving information they have been hoping for and have not admitted hoping for. "Are you well?" he said. "Entirely," she said. "That is the most important question," he said. "I know it is," she said. "The answer is yes." He put his arms around her and she felt, against her hair, the deep breath he let out, which was not merely a breath but a release of something held. Their 3rd child arrived in September of 1888, and she was another girl, born with a full head of dark hair and Silas's gray eyes, and they named her Rose, reclaiming a name they had used as Clara's middle name and felt deserved to be central. Rose was from the beginning a quiet, observant child, unlike her siblings in volume but not in perception, and she had a way of watching adults in a conversation that made those adults sometimes forget she was there until they looked over and found her dark eyes fixed on them with complete attention. Silas said once that Rose would be a writer. "She may be anything she chooses," Louisa said. "Of course," he said. "I only mean that she is recording everything. She is exactly like you when you are gathering information, very still, very thorough." Louisa looked at her youngest daughter, who was then about 18 months old and sitting on the kitchen floor, very deliberately stacking wooden blocks her father had made for her with an expression of concentration that was indeed recognizable. "She may be," Louisa said. The Courier ran through the end of the decade with Thomas Creek, now capable of running the whole production independently, though Louisa wrote the editorials and the major pieces herself always. The paper had grown from 2 pages to 4, and it was distributed to a subscription list that now reached neighboring counties and had a handful of subscribers as far away as Dallas. In 1889, Texas was not yet a different place, but it was becoming one, the frontier retreating into history as settlement advanced. The wildness of it was fading at the edges, being replaced by courts and county offices and committees, which were both improvements and losses, and Louisa wrote about both aspects without sentimentality and without pretending the change was simple. Silas read all of it. He read it at the kitchen table in the evenings on the porch, sometimes on horseback between the fields when she gave him a copy to take with him. He had not lost his dry humor about being the husband of a newspaper editor, and he maintained it with affection. "You have named me again," he said one morning, reading the paper. "I have quoted you accurately," she said. "You have attributed to me an opinion I expressed privately." "It was an excellent opinion," she said. "It needed wider circulation." "Louisa," he said, "the county needed to know that the road survey through the North Range is badly planned," she said. "You said so more clearly than anyone." I attributed it to a local rancher with extensive knowledge of the terrain, which could be any one of a dozen men. "It is obviously me," he said, Only to those who know you, she said. He folded the paper with the particular crispness of a man exercising patience. You have been doing this for 7 years, he said, and I have not found an argument that works. No, she said pleasantly. You have not. He had kissed her despite himself and gone out to the yard. Samuel, at 7, was already reading the Courier independently and asking questions about what he read, and Louisa answered them with the same seriousness she brought to any factual inquiry. He asked about Cole's case, which he had found referenced in old issues she kept bound in the back of the shop, and she told him the full story with age-appropriate detail, and he listened with his father's stillness and his mother's focused attention and then asked, "Did you ever worry that something bad would happen to you?" "Yes," she said. "Were you scared?" "Very scared sometimes," she said. "But you kept doing it anyway," he said. "Yes," she said. He considered this for a moment with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has encountered something he needs to fit into his understanding of the world. "That is what courage is," he said, which was something his father had apparently told him at some point because it was Silas's particular formulation. "That is exactly what it is," she said. She told Silas that evening, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone moved without being surprised. "He is a good person," he said. "He has excellent teachers," she said, which was not a compliment she offered casually, and he received it the way she intended it. The decade turned. 1890 brought drought again, the land reverting to its truest character after the wet spring of 1888, and the county struggled through it with the collective grim determination of people who had no alternative. Silas's operation was better positioned than most, and he shared what he could share without making a ceremony of it, which was the way he did everything that mattered. 3 neighboring small ranchers came through the drought in better condition than they would have otherwise because Silas Abbott had a particularly good water management system on the AA and was willing to explain it to anyone who asked. The Courier published a practical guide to drought management that Louisa wrote by compiling every piece of agricultural knowledge available to her, including a long interview with an old German farmer named Heinrich Schiefer, who had been through 3 droughts and had observations that were more useful than anything in any published almanac. The piece was reprinted in the Dallas Morning News, and she received a note from the Texas Agricultural Society. Through the drought, Clara turned 5 and began school, announcing on her first day that she intended to learn everything, which her teacher found delightful and somewhat exhausting. Rose, at 2, stood on the porch with her father and watched her sister's departure with an expression that was recognizably the expression of someone filing information. Louisa had been thinking, through that year, about a question that had begun as abstract and was becoming concrete. What the Courier should look like in 10 years, when the frontier it had been born on was no longer frontier in any meaningful sense. Thomas Creek was 27 now, experienced and capable, and the paper was his as much as hers in terms of daily operation. What she wanted to write was changing, moving from the urgent accountability journalism of the early years towards something more considered, more historical. The kind of journalism that described a place as it was changing, that captured what was being lost alongside what was being gained. She talked about this with Silas on a November evening in 1890, the drought still on the land but the evenings cooler, the air having that particular quality of a Texas fall that made everything feel slightly clarified. "You want to write a history," he said. "Not a history," she said. "A record. Something that says this is what it was and this is what it became, and here is the space between those 2 things where people lived." "The leather notebook," he said. She looked at him. "Your father's notebook," he said. "That is what you are describing, what he made for you and for himself, a record of the space between what was and what became." She had not thought of it in those terms. She turned it over carefully and found it was exactly right. "He would have done it himself," she said, "if he had lived long enough." "You will do it," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment. "I will need to travel," she said, "to gather accounts from other parts of the territory, to talk to people who are not in this county." Thomas can manage the paper, he said. The children are young, she said. The children have a father, he said, who is present and capable and who is not going anywhere. She looked at him in the lamplight and felt the fullness of what he was offering, not permission, which he had no authority to grant, but support, which he had every capacity to give. I will not be gone long at a time, she said. You will be gone as long as the work requires, he said. And you will come home and tell me everything. You are the best man I know, she said. I know several men who would dispute that, he said. They are wrong, she said. She began the work she was calling, in her own mind, the Record, the following year. She traveled in 1891 to San Antonio and to Austin and to Fort Worth, talking to ranchers and homesteaders and shopkeepers, and a judge who had been on the bench since before the Civil War, and who had a memory like a courthouse filing system. She talked to women who had come west as she had, under their own conviction, and women who had come under very different circumstances, and she listened to all of them. She came home from each journey to Silas and the children and the front porch and the mesquite tree and the smell of the ranch in the mornings, which was grass and horses and good plain air, and the specific relief of that arrival was something she would not have known to want before she had it. Samuel, who was 9 by then, had become interested in horses the way only a child with daily access to them can be, and spent hours in the barn with the ranch hands, absorbing knowledge they were happy to give because he was a respectful and attentive student. Clara had decided at 6 that she was going to be a doctor, an announcement that the family received with complete seriousness. Rose at 3 was still watching everything, and had begun to talk with a precision that suggested she had been waiting until she had something accurate to say. In 1892, Louisa published the first installment of what would become, over the following years, the work that outlasted the Courier itself. She called it simply Redemption and Beyond, Accounts of the Texas Frontier. It was published in the paper first, in long installments, and collected eventually by a printer in Austin into a book, a real book, bound, with her name on the spine. The copy she brought home from Austin, she placed on the shelf beside her father's leather notebook. Silas looked at them side by side for a long time. Then he turned to her and said nothing, which was sometimes the most complete response available to him, and which she had learned over the years was worth more than most speeches. He would have been proud, Silas said, and his voice was careful the way it got when he was holding something at a precise distance. I think so, she said. He sent you west with a printer's box and 30 years of his best thinking, Silas said, and you built everything he would have hoped for from both of them. She stood in front of the bookshelf in their sitting room with her father's leather notebook and her own book side by side, and she felt the continuity of the two, the thread that ran from his hands to hers, from his composing stick to hers, from his conviction to hers, and she thought it was not the same as him being alive and knowing it, but it was the next thing to that, the closest a living person can come to speaking directly to the dead. She turned away from the shelf and Silas was standing close enough that she could put her head against his chest without moving more than a step, and so she did, and he wrapped his arms around her and she felt the solid warmth of him, the specific and familiar weight of the person who had become, over 9 years, the ground she stood on. Thank you, she said, against his chest. For what? He said. For everything after the printer's box and the opinions, she said. She felt him smile against the top of her head. The opinions were the interesting part, he said. The printer's box I could have done without. She pulled back far enough to look at him. You could not, she said. No, he said honestly. I could not. The double a ranch ran through the next decade with the steady, accumulated competence of something built by people who intended it to last. Samuel took on his first real responsibilities at 12, working alongside the hands with the seriousness of a boy who understood that he was not playing at work but beginning it. Clara, at 11, had not abandoned her intention of becoming a doctor, and Silas had written a careful letter to a medical college in the East explaining his daughter's interest, and had received back a careful response that told him what she would need to study in preparation. And Clara had begun that preparation with the focused energy of someone for whom a goal is a practical problem rather than a dream. Rose, at 8, had begun to write. Not assignments, not diary entries, but a careful and unprompted observation of the world around her, kept in a notebook that she carried in her dress pocket, and consulted with the same habitual seriousness with which her mother consulted her compositor's box. Louisa discovered this not by prying, but by finding a pencil on the kitchen floor, and following the notebook it had fallen from to the child sitting on the back steps, writing a precise description of the way the wind moved through the mesquite tree. She did not interrupt Rose. She went back inside and told Silas, who put down the harness he was mending and looked at her and said, "Well, yes," she said. "She got it from you," he said. "She got it from her grandfather," Louisa said. "I only carried it west." The years continued to build, as years do when the life they contain is a good one, each one adding to the weight and texture of the whole without diminishing what came before. Thomas Creek ran the Courier with increasing independence, hiring his own assistant, and Louisa remained the paper's editorial conscience, but she had made her central work the books, which were now 2, with a 3rd in preparation. She was 42 in 1898, and Silas was 44, and both of them had the particular quality of people who have been shaped by years of work and weather, and feeling into something denser and more durable than they had started. He had more gray in his hair, which he wore the same way he had always worn it, wanting cutting, but not getting it quite as often as it wanted. She had lines at the corners of her eyes and around her mouth that she did not mind because they were the marks of expression she was glad to have made. Samuel was 16 and had the frame of a man and the thoughtfulness of one too, though with an adolescent edge of uncertainty he mostly managed well. Clara, at 15, had completed the preparatory reading the medical college had specified and was corresponding directly with the college registrar, a process she managed herself entirely, which neither parent interfered with. Rose, at 10, had filled 3 notebooks and showed no sign of stopping. On a May evening in 1898, Silas and Louisa sat on the front porch as they had done on 1,000 evenings since the ranch had become her home, and the grass was green again after a good winter, and the mesquite tree was in full ridiculous bloom, and the sound of the children inside was audible and comfortable, and the sky was performing its Texas exhibition in the west. "We should have another one," Louisa said. Silas turned his head to look at her. "Another child," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone doing arithmetic that is also something more than arithmetic. "You are 42, he said carefully, which was not a refusal, only an observation. "I am aware," she said. 42 is not ancient." "No," he agreed, "it is not." "The doctor said I am in excellent health," she said. "I asked him." "When did you ask him?" "Last week," she said. "I wanted the information before I raised the subject." He looked at her with the expression he had been producing for 16 years and had never entirely mastered, the one where he was trying to manage the full weight of how much he loved her and not always succeeding. "You gathered the information first," he said. "I always do," she said. He reached over and took her hand. He turned it over and looked at it, as he sometimes did, at her fingers that were shaped by years of setting type, and then he held it without looking at anything in particular. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "Yes," he said, "all right." Their 4th child arrived in the spring of 1899, a boy, and they named him for the county that had made them what they were together, calling him Redemption John Abbott, which was a very large name for a very small baby, and they called him Red from the first day, which suited him entirely and which he wore into adulthood with the ease of someone for whom a name is simply true. Red arrived into a household that was already a world, 3 older siblings who received him with varying degrees of ceremony. Samuel, at 17, with the studied calm of someone trying to seem less moved than he was. Clara, at 16, with efficient practicality and genuine delight. Rose, at 11, with her notebook in her pocket. and what their father accurately described as a look of someone who has just acquired a new subject. Louisa lay in the bedroom of the stone house with her newest son in the crook of her arm, and listened to the sounds of her household, which were Silas's voice in the hallway speaking to the children in the particular low tone he used when he was managing their volume, and outside the window the mesquite tree making its spring sound in the wind, and from somewhere in the house the sound of Clara reading to Rose, who was reading too but tolerated being read to as a companionable activity, and Samuel's boots on the porch, pacing the way his father paced when he was feeling something he was not going to say out loud. She looked down at Red, who was asleep with the authority of a person who has just completed a very difficult journey and has earned the rest, and she felt the full weight of everything the life contained, not a weight that pressed down but the kind of weight that anchors, that gives a thing substance and holds it steady against the forces that would otherwise move it. Silas came in. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and then at her, and the look was the one she had known for 16 years, unguarded and complete. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your mouth," he said. "We will argue about this for years," she said. "Yes," he said, "we will." He reached out and smoothed a strand of hair from her forehead, and his hand was warm, the same hand that had smoothed out that crumpled broadsheet against his thigh on a September morning in 1882, and she thought about how much distance there was between that morning and this one, and how it had not felt like distance at all but like a continuous and building thing. "I told you," she said. "You tell me many things," he said. "What specifically?" "That the printer's box and the opinions were going to be worth it," she said. He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the managed version, the real one, full and unhurried. "You did not tell me that," he said. "I told you they would cause trouble." "And I told you I did not find that persuasive," she said. "You were right," he said. "You were right about all of it. The water rights and the broadsheet and the federal agent and the fact that I was in love with you before I was willing to say so." "I know," she said. "You always know," he said. "Almost always," she said. "What do you not know?" he said. She looked at the window, at the particular light of a May afternoon in Texas, gold and generous, coming through the glass onto the floor of the room where her newest son was sleeping. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "That is the part I find most interesting." Silas looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Let me read you something." He reached over to the bedside table and picked up the leather notebook, her father's notebook, which she kept there, which was where she had kept it since the day she had put it beside her own book on the shelf, and then moved it here because she wanted it close. He opened it to a page near the middle, a page covered in her father's small, precise handwriting, and he read aloud, "The truth is not a thing you discover once and keep. It requires daily renewal, daily examination, daily willingness to find you were wrong about something you were certain of. The best journalists are not certain people. They are people who are certain enough to ask the next question." He closed the notebook and held it for a moment, and then he placed it back on the table. "He wrote that," Silas said. "He did," she said. "He was describing you," Silas said, 20 years before he knew you would come here." She felt the room very clearly around her, the bed and the light and the sleeping child and the man she had loved for 16 years and would go on loving for as long as she could hold a composing stick or form a sentence or look at the evening sky over the Brazos and find it still remarkable. "We are going to be all right," she said. "We have always been all right," he said. "We are going to continue to be," she said. He took her free hand, the one not holding the baby, and held it. "Yes," he said, "we are." Outside, Samuel had stopped pacing. Inside, Clara had stopped reading and Rose had opened her notebook. The mesquite tree made its spring sound in the wind, and the light moved across the floor of the room, and the Redemption Courier was being printed at that moment by Thomas Creek, who had set the type himself, and somewhere in the compositor's box in the back of the print shop, the letters waited in their orderly rows for the next piece, the next truth, the next line of honest words that needed setting before the world could read them. And in the stone house 8 miles east of Redemption, Texas, in the spring of 1899, Louisa Fairchild Abbott held her son and held her husband's hand and looked at the window, and she was certain enough to ask the next question, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be.